I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
Now on a story we're following out of Russia concerning a prominent Kremlin critic. Alexei Navalny is said to be in a coma after a suspected poisoning.
And my job is to not be afraid and go back to Russia. I can see that Kremlin right now, they do everything to prevent me being back to Moscow, but it's never going to happen.
Free Alexei Navalny, a call that rang out across Russia this Saturday. This Sunday will go down as the day of mass arrests, when Putin's police hauled in one protester after the next, just for showing up to an unsanctioned rally.
Mr. Navalny, like all Russian citizens, is entitled to his rights under the Russian Constitution. He's been targeted for exposing corruption. He should be released immediately and without condition.
On January 18th, Alexei Navalny returned to Russia following his near-fatal poisoning. Immediately after his arrival, he was arrested, prompting massive protests over the following weeks. Alexander Gabuev is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Today, we'll be talking about the return of Alexei Navalny to Russia and what it means for Putin's regime. Sasha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Laura. Always a pleasure.
Tell me, Sasha, what was Navalny arrested for exactly, and how did his treatment deviate from normal judicial matters?
Well, in real life, he was arrested for his political activity. By letter of the law, he was arrested for violating the terms of his parole. He was convicted in 2014 for a very murky case with his brother, which was later on acknowledged by the European Court for Human Rights to be a fake political trial. But because he was convicted, he had to come to the police office every month and check in with them. His parole was ending December 2020, but for obvious reasons, he couldn't show up because he was seeking treatment in Germany.
Because he had been poisoned.
Because he has been poisoned, exactly. He was missing some of the dates of his check-in with police early in the year because of the pandemic. But the police and the authorities got really worried and started to send notifications when he was in Germany. And I think that the clear message was you should not return to Mother Russia. But he still did, because his idea was that as a local politician and leader of Russian protests, he needs to be in the country with his people. So he got arrested and he got convicted, and he will now spend 2.5 years in prison starting from February 2021.
Do you think that the Kremlin anticipated the protests and their scale, or did they miscalculate how people would react?
I think that they anticipated some protests because the protest is really not new. It's probably bigger in terms of geography covered on the second weekend of the protest, January 31. We saw about 150 cities protesting across Russia from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad. But in reality, in 2017, with the previous very successful investigation by Mr. Navalny into corruption by then Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev and alleged wealth that he has amassed while in office, we had seen protests in about 100 cities and towns across Russia. So it's a difference, but it's not a very big difference. And this time, the crowd size was pretty modest for two most important cities, Moscow and St. Pete. And then the government was gradually piling up the level of police brutality and violence in order to deter the protesters from coming to the streets. So the Kremlin was prepared in a way.
I want to talk about the police violence in just a minute, but just a quick question again on sort of Navalny's legal fight. You know, did the government have any other options for how to deal with him and his return than the one they took, do you think?
Legally, for sure, because the original case was really a show trial, and then the violations of his parole term were really insignificant. So they had an option to say in the court that you can walk as a free man, really doesn't matter. Next time you should check in with the police. Politically, they could also not make this case moving because one of the rational strategy was just to ignore him and continue with saying that the poisoning is all fake. It's staged by the CIA and Western intelligence services. He poisoned himself. But then to show that, as Vladimir Putin said it personally, that nobody was really that interested and worried about his activity in the Russian government as to poison him with a military North Asian grade weapon, Novichok. So they could let him go free and just trust in the deep wells of cynicism and political inertia of the Russian people. Probably nothing terrible would happen. But because they have warned him not to come back, they didn't want to look weak. So they went out to arrest him and to destroy the political machine that he has created over the course of the last couple of years across Russia. So now the political movement that Mr. Navalny set in motion definitely will be destroyed or put under very harsh stress by the authorities.
So the Russian police forces, as you mentioned, responded with a very strong show of violence, arresting several thousand protesters. But what does the fact that they had to arrest so many, do you think, say about the government's strength and leverage?
I think that Mr. Navalny's supporters like Leonid Volkov and others interpret this as a sign of weakness. So why would a very popular, legitimate leader like Vladimir Putin would need to use violence? But the problem is that it's an autocratic system that operates on legitimacy, but also operates on this toolkit of violence. And this time around, I don't think that we have seen too much new, frankly. People who say that this level of violence is unprecedented have probably been living in a very different country that I did. But beating of the protesters or putting a plastic bag over the head of 21-year-old political activists and threatening her to torture with electricity is not something entirely new. I think that here we saw a preparation with the parliament passing a package of restrictive laws end of last year in order to raise the price tag for protest. So, for example, you get fined if you go for an unsanctioned protest rally for the first time. You get a much bigger fine the second time. And for the third time, you might end up in prison for up to 1 or 2 years. There is a new article in the penal code for obstructing the traffic. For example, if there is a large protesting crowd on the sidewalk and you get pushed to the road, you can end up in prison for 1 year. So there are multiple restrictive laws that are meant to scare people off the streets. And this time around, even when 20 up to 40,000, which is a very optimistic estimate of protesters show up in downtown Moscow, it's not a very big deal for a city of 13 million. And Moscow has seen far bigger protests on Putin's watch just 10 years ago. But in order to scare the people and raise the price tag really high up front, and not just wait till the people get used to the idea that it's okay and normal to protest, that there are no risks attached, the regime resorted to measured police violence. But I would argue it's far less level of violence and brutality that we've seen in Minsk, for example. And that's part of the explanation why the protest died down or was called off by Mr. Navalny's team so quickly.
So was the idea maybe last week or the week before that Putin's regime is under threat, some kind of Western fantasy? You know, how do you see the threat, if any, to the regime itself?
I think it is indeed a fantasy to see the movement that Mr. Navalny has launched as a real challenge to the Putin regime. So the idea that Putin is sitting in his bunker or in his luxury palace, shivering fear and counting days will he become next Muammar Gaddafi is just insane. It's definitely a disturbance. It comes at a time when the grievances of the population are mounting. The pandemic is still there. The unemployment caused by lockdowns is still there. We have a drop in disposable incomes of the population by roughly 3.5%. last year. And then Russia is going into parliamentary elections in September this year. And that's a pretty important milestone for the regime. And that's why the Putin regime wanted to deal away with the protests very early on. And I think that the slogan here is better be safe than sorry.
Mm-hmm.
That explains the logic why the regime reacts to the protests the way it does.
Yeah, so stop it before it gets any momentum. I guess my question is then, what would have to happen for the protests to truly make an impact?
We will need to see far bigger crowds. And I think that the benchmark here would be the demonstrations in the last year of the Soviet Union, where nearly 500,000 people came to the streets of Moscow right in front of the Kremlin. So that was a very significant show of force and will of the people that they will not tolerate the ways the country was ruled. We haven't seen this scale of protest anytime under Putin, like in 20 years that he's in power. And I think that the crowd size really matters. What also matters would be splits in the law enforcement agencies and the civics, the police. So you need to have cops to stand with the people. And you need to see cracks in the elite. Nothing of that is happening. The crowd size is pretty modest and can be managed by the regime by using the tools that it uses right now on the streets and in the police stations where people are detained.
We'll be back in a moment to talk about who is participating in these protests and what they're fighting for. Sasha, I want to talk a bit more about the protest movement itself. One thing that has been said is that the protests are anti-regime and anti-corruption, but not necessarily pro-democracy or pro-Navalny. How do you explain this for our listeners?
I think that there is a pretty broad base of Russians who are right now angry at the regime. And I think that the fertile ground for this is really the management of the pandemic and the economic crisis that Russia finds itself in. And by that, I mean to say that the protests we are seeing in Russia are not unique. There are many people protesting around the world. So the way to channel this right now is politics. And Mr. Navalny is trying to use this popular anger at the worsening state of their households and channel that into his political fight against Putin, and to say that the root cause of their declining incomes is corruption. So we see a pretty broad spectrum of people, those who advocate for a more liberal, democratic, or pro-Western Russia, those who are more on the left side, socialists, even communists, those who are against the regime, those who are nationalists and are fans of kind of Mr. Navalny's populism and his slogans that Russia should belong to the Russians that date to the previous decade. So there is a pretty broad base for this protest in terms of ideological views, not in terms of the numbers.
Right. And in speaking of corruption, one of the things that seemed to help fuel the protests was a video that Navalny did alleging that Putin has this hidden hideaway complex, and the videos of police brutality that have also been widely shared. How is the internet and that kind of online sharing and media impacting the sentiment of ordinary Russian citizens?
Unfortunately, Laura, we don't have very good data so far to measure that. If you go online and are in the echo chamber of your Facebook friends or your Twitter followers, who are mostly, for most of the Russia watchers in the West and within the country, like many analysts, are pretty liberal-minded. So they have a certain echo chamber, and it takes a lot of time to build your Facebook following or the accounts that you follow on Twitter to have like various sets of opinions, and then to try to figure out how really widespread a certain sentiment is. And by the way, Facebook and Twitter are really upper middle class, educated tools for communication for the Russians. Bulk of the Russians spend their time on local analogies like Vkontakte or Odnoklassniki or other for online forums. So you need.
And this is actually a problem worldwide, that it's so hard to get a sense of sort of everyday sentiment now with the fracturing of where people are. So, I mean, go on, but it's obviously not just a Russia-only problem.
Exactly. That's not a Russia-only problem. So as a scholar or analyst, you need to be really aware. So you need to look for polling data, and you need to try to collect your sample of opinions that would be representative. And I think that unfortunately a problem with some analysts is that they sit in this liberal echo chamber where there are a lot of emotional Navalny supporters. They see some images of police violence and say, oh, that's terrible. Not denying that's terrible. You need to put this violence in context. And then if you put that even in Russian context, you see that it's not different from the levels of violence we've seen in 2017 or in other years where there was street protests in Russia. So nothing has really changed. And it is pretty brutal, but it's kind of more or less the same level that police uses against protesters in many other countries. And that, by the way, is very skillfully used by the regime. So they produce the whole clips that they put in the very same social networks and see, this is police in New York City kind of going after BLM activists. This is police in the Netherlands who are fighting and pushing back against dissatisfied COVID dissidents. And they are very great in manipulating the information and saying, this is police. Police is police everywhere. They have to protect law and order. And by the way, the West doesn't have the moral authority to tell us how to handle the protest, because look at what's happening there. So it's very hard to understand the attitude of the Russian people before we have convincing polling data. But we have that on Navalny's investigation video.
Okay.
So it's 2 hour long. It has been watched more than 100 million times on YouTube, and around less than 30 million Russians have watched it. So people have watched it multiple times. People have watched it on different devices, hence the difference. But it's interesting that 1/3 of people who watched it say that they don't believe it because they think that it's fake.
Well, this is another problem worldwide, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then only 17 people believe it. And the rest says, well, it might be true, but we don't know. The information is unreliable. And then the polling data shows that Mr. Navalny's support level has grown recently, also because of this investigation, from 2% nationwide to 5% nationwide. That's pretty low. So it has expanded, and it's growing in the category of people who are in the age range of 18 and 24. That's probably important. Although I think a lot of analysis is based on the assumption that Putin has lost the younger generation. Well, people might be pretty radical in their views in that age, and many of them might change their opinion in the future. So it will be very interesting to watch what happened to the generation that went to the largest protest on Putin's watch, the Bolotnaya Square protest in 2011. We don't have good data here, but just based on my observation in my social circle, because that was basically my generation. I was 26 at that time, and many people around me went. So bulk of the people became pretty passive. They say, we've been going out for 10 years, nothing happened. Life has improved somewhat. There are less freedoms, but the economy's kind of muddling through. It's okay. I better do my internal immigration. I better be absorbed with my career, family life. There are people who have immigrated and went to the beautiful United States of America or Israel or Europe. There are people who are still supporters of liberal ideas and protesters. So it's very hard to see what happens to this kind of group of people who are now very young, very idealistic and supportive of Mr. Navalny in, say, 5 years. But again, the support for him and his ideas is growing, but it's not really making a huge difference. So it's chipping off the legitimacy of the regime and Mr. Putin, but not still in significant way to really challenge his stature in Russian politics.
I'm still intrigued by this idea that the protests are smaller than they have been in the past, but that the base of support seems larger, or maybe, that the reasons people are there are so varied, it's a little bit fractured. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. And, your Carnegie colleague, Alexander Navalny, wrote that, quote, the protests have a broader support base than usual liberal protests and those by Navalny supporters. And polling, which you just talked about, said that more than 40% of those polled said this was the first time they had ever taken part in a protest. So square these two things for me. Smaller protests, but the movement's more broad-based. How do you read that?
So again, there are many people who come there for various reasons. And probably the level of people, and that's, I think, seen in the polls, that the number of Russians who say that the country goes in a bad direction is growing.
Okay.
The levels of Putin support are going down, but that's explainable also because of COVID. And I think that if you are impatient and cynical enough and watch Putin's popularity over 2 decades that he's in power now, it goes up and down. And now we are all in this mess together. It's very hard to expect that Mr. Putin's popularity will go up significantly because, well, Russia is not immune to COVID. Yes, we have vaccine and pretty early rollout of vaccination program, but the economy is very dependent on oil and gas. We had this collapse of the oil price last spring. It's gradually recovering, and people have yet to feel that their incomes will recover too. And by the way, the government is just about to announce a massive stimulus package that will be targeted handouts to the people most vulnerable and most affected. And it's just 0.5% of GDP. But surprise, surprise, this tactics time and again has worked in Mr. Putin's favor. Last summer, when he needed to pass this changes in the constitution that will allow him to run again in 2024 for 2 6-year terms, they did very limited, very targeted handouts to people who are doctors or have kids and stuff. And surprise, surprise, the constitutional referendum passed without any major challenges or protests to the regime. So people were happy about that. And I don't see any reasons why this trick won't work. So that partly...
the tried and true tactic.
Yeah, that's partly explains why the protest base might be large, but it's very hard to galvanize it because people are dissatisfied, but they say, okay, but where is the alternative? And probably at some point, Putin will come and open his wallet and pull a small bill on my plate, and that will be fine. And then again, the price tag for organized protests for going out is now much higher than it used to be 10 years ago. So many people argue that those like nearly more than 6,000 people who have been arrested and will serve like 15 to 30 days in prison, they will come die-hard revolutionaries. And they will be like the iron core of Navalny's support team, like the Bolsheviks, or many members of the Indian liberation movement, or the people in South Africa who fought apartheid, that this will be the core. Well, it's questionable, and we need to see. I think that many people will be scared to death, and they will not take to the streets anymore. And we've seen this movie time and again. Repressive regimes are very smart and calibrated in the way they're using violence. The example I brought about the 21-year-old volunteer in the team of Lyubov Sobol, Mr. Navalny's supporter in Moscow. So this girl was taken into custody by the police. They took a plastic bag, put on her head, and threatened to torture her. it's not something abnormal that doesn't happen in Russian prisons or in police stations. We know that sometimes it happens to random people. No, it's not kind of the norm, but these incidents happen. This time around, it's the only documented incident. And it looks like the police officers didn't try to hide it. So they did it deliberately because they knew that she will go out and tell about it to the media. The message was that this can happen to anybody if you are a volunteer in an oppositional political campaign, and nothing will happen. There will be no investigation. There will be no court protest. And I guess many young people get the message. Their parents get the message. So the regime doesn't need to torture dozens and hundreds and thousands of people, the mistake that Lukashenko did. They need to intimidate just one young person, make her story heard across the independent media. And that's why they also need the independent media, because all of the protesters go to this independent media and trust them. And that's an echo chamber. When you just throw one message, it gets heard, it gets processed, and I think it will scare and deter a lot of people from participation.
One last question on the protest movements and crowds. Many analysts have drawn parallels between this movement and the protest movement in Belarus, where hundreds of thousands of people were on the street to oppose Lukashenko. Do you see parallels at all?
There are parallels, of course. Lukashenko has been in power for more than 2 decades. There is natural fatigue. The economy is not doing well. And then there was a terrible, terrible government response to COVID because Lukashenko was a very vivid COVID denier up to the last moment. And that made a lot of people very, very angry. So there are parallels, but I think that the Russian regime has handled COVID much better. Yes, the healthcare system isn't perfect. There is a lot of corruption, and there are deep structural issues that are going back kind of years of Putin's mismanagement. At the same time, the system has got far better than it used to be in the 90s, because obviously back then the average price for a barrel of oil was around $15. On Putin's watch, it was like an average price of 60 or more. So there is much more money in the healthcare system. And though it's corrupt, it's far better run and more efficient than it used to be. So, and then Putin was no COVID denier. So the level of anger about the COVID management was far less in Russia than in Belarus. I think that the Russian media are freer, so there is much more talk about the government corruption. And that's why everybody is much more used to it. So it's not an eye-opening investigation that suddenly we woke up in a different Russia where people finally has found out that their president is stealing money and using various dodgy schemes to build a secret palace. And like a lot of this information has been available already in the public domain. And then I think that something that inflamed the protests in Belarus was really the amount of repression and the level of police brutality. So it's affected about 20% of dwellers of Minsk, where the people that you know have been brought to custody, tortured, raped, beaten. I think that the Russian government has figured out the level of the violence needed to scare the protesters off far better than the proportion of Novichok that they wanted to use against Navalny. So here they are. They turn to be much more savvy and skillful than their Belarusian colleagues.
We'll be right back to talk about where the protest movement goes from here. With Navalny sentenced and imprisoned and many of his allies threatened or arrested, what impact do you expect to see in the coming weeks and months?
I think that the government is really now on a serious crusade about the movement, because the first term that Navalny will serve is 2.5 years. He's very likely to miss 2024 presidential campaign. But there are other court cases against him. There is a defamation case against a war veteran, like World War II veteran. There are other potential cases for fraud in his anti-corruption foundation. The government claims that he has stolen money from the donations. And as was demonstrated by the most recent court just a couple of days back, the government can prove in court anything they want. So it's really a shame trial. And I don't think that there will be any costs attached to them. So they handle it with impunity. And it's very likely that Mr. Navalny will spend many years behind bars, and hopefully nothing terrible happens to him in prison. But they also understand that Navalny's brilliance is that he's not a one-man show. He has a team, and that team has a pretty developed infrastructure in the Russian regions. And they also have some core team members outside of Russia in Vilnius or London. So now the Russian government is going after everybody they can target inside Russia to destroy this infrastructure and to intimidate Navalny supporters. And I think they have all the means to do that. That's what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks and months.
And what role do you think his wife, Yulia, will play as the movement goes forward? She was obviously, a prominent part of this narrative over the last couple of weeks and seen in the courtroom and all of that.
So I think that she is charismatic and popular. They kind of, from the image and PR viewpoint, they work as a couple because they're very funny on the internet. They are far more genuine, like a normal family, because the Russian leadership preaches traditional values. But we know that Mr. Putin is divorced. He is rumored to have multiple mistresses and probably some children with those mistresses. So, and his personal life is definitely not at display the way American presidents display the first family, which is kind of a very important public institution in itself. So in Russia, there is this only guy, Vladimir Putin, and we don't know nothing about his private life. And we know that many members of his entourage who pay lip service to this traditional values narrative, in fact, have multiple mistresses, families. So I think that Navalny family is showing much more on how to be genuine and normal. So Yulia Navalny is quite popular. The big question mark is whether she can have a political life of her own if her husband is in custody. No doubt there is a lot of public sympathy. And the way in America, you get political seniority being in the US Senate. In Russia, if you are a political dissident, you get moral authority and seniority if you are in prison, because the sympathy towards you grows. And a very interesting example here is Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was in prison in 2003, and many Russian people didn't like Mr. Khodorkovsky. He was very rich in a very poor country. Many people knew that he made his money in the 90s using various schemes that were not totally legal. So his public reputation was pretty low. After he has served a 10 years prison term, his reputation has improved significantly because, like, whatever the deeds, whatever the crimes he committed were definitely nullified by his prison sentence. And everybody realized by then that he's there in prison not because he's an oligarch. There are many oligarchs who haven't paid their taxes. He was there because he challenged Putin. So that might happen to Mr. Navalny. It's unclear whether that will be translated to popularity of his wife. And then now there is a group of patriotic business people in Russia who are trying to introduce a ban for members of the families of people who are foreign agents. That's the label officially used against Mr. Navalny, to run for public offices. And it can remind you the Stalin era designation of enemy of the people, and the family members of the enemy of the people didn't have rights. So, for example, if you are a wife of somebody who was in prison and sent to Gulag, you couldn't do many jobs, and basically your life was very miserable. So there are some parallels here.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation that Russia has parliamentary elections coming up in September, I believe. Do you think there will be any impact at the ballot box from what we've seen over the last couple of weeks?
I don't think that the protest itself will be a significant factor here. Team Navalny tries to use the so-called smart voting strategy. So they call anybody who is against Mr. Putin to vote for members of other parties than the Putin's party, United Russia. And they have tested this approach in the Moscow City Council elections and in many other local elections. And that's kind of the message that this is the way we're going to destroy Putin's political machine. I'm quite skeptical, to be frank, because all of the really dangerous candidates, the candidates that the government doesn't like, are banned from running upfront. And that happened, by the way, with Mr. Navalny's supporters in Moscow City Council elections in 2019. So everybody who is allowed to run is sort of comfortable for the regime, or is the evil that the regime can deal with. We have changed the way we elect our parliament. Half is done by a single district MP, and half of the parliament is composed by the party lists. So United Russia can perform worse than 5 years ago on the party list. And the government can allow that to happen and justify that with the impact of COVID. But then a lot of so-called independent candidates will be de facto the government's proteges, and this will be the candidates from the regime. So I think that it's very easy for the government to retain control over the parliament. The broader drivers of people's discontent will be still in play: COVID, poverty, inequality, corruption. But with these little handouts that we talked about before, and there could be many more handouts, because Russia, after all, has nearly $600 billion in the foreign reserves of the central bank, and nearly $200 billion in the rainy day fund of the government. So they are spending now less than $10 billion for this handout. So it's nothing. They have a lot of money to do that again closer to the election. And this trick has worked so many times. I will be very surprised to see why this trick won't work this time.
Going outside Russia for a moment, President Biden, in his foreign policy speech last week, demanded that the Kremlin release Navalny from prison, citing abuse of his rights under the Russian Constitution. We already talked a little bit about that. Does the Biden administration, in your view, or the international community, I know the EU was just there, actually have leverage in this situation?
I don't think so. We have seen multiple Russian political activists being imprisoned, starting from Mikhail Khodorkovsky and many others. And the West always has called for their release, and nothing has happened. So we see these calls time and again in countries that are not nuclear armed. They are far smaller than Russia. They are far weaker than Putin regime. And still, the West doesn't necessarily has leverage there. So I don't think that the West has real leverage in the particular case of Mr. Navalny.
You've talked a little bit about how Putin is trying to address sort of general malaise with these economic bumps, things like that. I'm just wondering if we look at the very big picture in terms of Russia's economy, turning from an oil-based industry, looking ahead to sort of the tech revolution that's around the world. How do you see the Russian government sort of managing growth, managing its future, connected but separate from this?
So by and large, Russia is far more stable in the long run than some of the petrostates that are heavily dependent on oil and gas industry only and are bad in managing their public finance. So I would be more worried about Saudi Arabia than I would be worried about Russia structurally, because Russia has much more than just oil and gas. Yes, oil and gas are up to 60% of the revenues of the Russian budget, but then there are metals, fertilizers, food as export items, and the internal economy is still pretty big and pretty diversified. There are also new sources of growth. The regime's problem is that first, it doesn't do the structural reforms needed that will unlock the entrepreneurial talent of the Russian people. For that, you obviously need an independent judiciary, which would infringe on the ability of the regime to do anything it wants and limit the freedom of maneuvering of the regime and corrupt law enforcement system, corrupt officialdom. And so far, the oil and gas revenue allows you to compensate for the shortcomings of the system. So you can still keep a lot of people sort of happy or sort of so poor that they are absorbed in their day-to-day survival mood that they don't have the time and resources to focus on politics or protests, or they are too kind of cynical to get involved. And regime manages that brilliantly. What happens when the magic pill disappears and you don't have this easy oil money is a big question mark. So yes, they have big reserves. They have the rainy day funds. But in order to really adapt and continue to grow, you need to do the bloody structural reform, which the regime so far is unable to do. And it's not that they don't see the end of the hydrocarbon age, but it's probably 10, 15, 20 years down the road. That might be not the time when Putin is still around. It's probably beyond the time horizon that's long-term for Mr. Putin. That's why he doesn't really care. So he cares somewhat as a statesman, but he doesn't care that much as a politician. And finally, one of the major pillars of the regime stability are open borders. So the Russians who are dissatisfied with the regime are welcome to immigrate. They're welcome to make their money in Silicon Valley. They're welcome to help Israel be the innovative economy the way it is. They're welcome to be IT specialists in London or in Germany. So the regime is happy to kick these people out. And that removes additional pressure in the kettle and allows you to kick the can down the road. Unfortunately, that steals from the very future of your country. But for the regime goals of survival, it's brilliant. So there is this contradiction that partially explains Mr. Putin's longevity as a politician.
Sasha, thank you so much for joining us and helping us unpack all this today.
Thank you so much.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter @LauraL.Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.